Fire alarm wiring diagrams. In this presentation, we're going to look at basic conventional and basic addressable fire alarm wiring diagrams. Let's start with conventional. This is an example of a conventional Class B single zone, single stage. It's got one IDC loop and one NAC loop. Let's start with the NAC loop, and the NAC loop is going to be wired with single conductors because the NAC loop is usually a higher ampacity load. So the single conductors are going to come from the fire alarm panel, go to the first signaling device, and since I only have one of them, they're going to then end at the end of line resistor for the NAC loop. Now the remainder of the circuit is going to be done with FAS cable, and the FAS cable is going to be run inside the EMT, so we don't have any armored FAS cable. Now remember, this is Class B, which means everything is going to be in a single loop until we get to the end of line resistor at the very bottom right. So, first cable, 16-2 FAS cable, goes to the heat detector. Second cable comes out of the heat detector and goes to the pull station. Out of the pull station, I'm then going to go to the smoke detector. Out of the smoky, I'm going to go down to the pull station, and finally from the pull station to my end of line resistor. And that would be all of the conductors necessary for this small Class B system. Here's another example. This one is a conventional Class B single zone, dual stage. So we have one IDC alarm loop, one IDC alert loop, and one NAC loop. And we can see here, I'm going to use the smoke detectors on my alert loop, and the pull stations are going to be on my alarm loop. So let's start with the NAC loop, which again is just a single device, and it ends at an end-of-line resistor because it's Class B. So single conductors, 14 gauge RW90 pulled into conduit. Now the remainder of the circuit is going to be done with two conductor FAS cable. The first one I'm going to take all the way down to my heat detector. This is going to start off my alert loop. Now I'm going to hit all of the alert items, and the alert items involve the pull stations as well as the additional smoke detector at the bottom. So out of the heat detector, I'm going to come and go into my two-stage pull station. It's going to go into the T-bar side, and then out of the T-bar side, I'm going to have to go all the way back down into my second pull station. Again, just going into the T-bar side. Remember, there are two separate features to a two-stage pull station, and one of them is a key. The key is going to be for the alarm side. Now I'm almost done my alert. I've got to come out of the two-stage pull station and go into the smoke detector off to the left. And then after that, I'm going to go all the way over to the end of line resistor for the alert loop. So now I'm done my alert loop, I have to do my alarm loop. So my alarm loop needs another FAS cable coming from the fire alarm system panel, and that's going to go to my first two-stage pull station over here. So let's install that. So now I've got a two-wire FAS cable that's coming down from my alarm. I've gone into my key, and now I've got to come out of the key section of my two-stage pull station, and I'm going to go down to the other two-stage pull station, to this one. So I'm going to take the cable out, go down there, and then finally from the second portion of that keyed side of the two-stage pull station, I'm going to end it at my EOL for the alarm IDC. Example C is a conventional Class A single zone, single stage. Out of the fire alarm panel, I'm first going to do my NAC loop, and this is going to be a Class A NAC. Not very common, but they still exist. So 14 gauge wire is going to be used into one conduit on one side of the fire alarm panel, which is the supply conduit, and then back on the return conduit. The second portion of this wiring will be FAS cable, and it's going to pick up both the smoke and the pull station. So out of my fire alarm panel comes a supply 16-2 FAS cable, and out of the smoke detector, I'm then going to pull another FAS cable to my pull station. Out of the pull station, I'm then going to go all the way back to my fire alarm panel, and this would be considered the return FAS cable. The following diagrams are going to be for addressable fire alarm systems. So let's take a look. This is example D, addressable DCLB. There will be no T-taps permitted just due to the manufacture of this particular system. There is one SLC loop, and we'll notice that we've got one NAC loop, which is Class B conventional. So first thing I'm going to start with is my NAC loop. That's going to be, again, 14 gauge single conductor cables, or single conductors pulled into EMT. Blah, blah, blah. So almost, well, I'd say exactly the same as our conventional system. Next is going to be with FAS cable. Now the main difference between this being a addressable versus the conventional is that addressable doesn't have any end-of-line resistors. So I'm going to choose to take my FAS cable first to this heat detector, then to the pull station, then to the second smoke detector, and end at the pull station at the very bottom. Of course, there's a number of different ways you could have done this, and overall, I don't think it would have mattered for the total number of conductors in these conduits up here. There's a lot of different paths that one could take, and they would kind of be determined by the length of the conduit to try to use the least amount of FAS cable. Example E is exactly the same, but now it's an addressable DCLB with T-taps permitted. So let's see how that changes things. The NAC loop is still going to remain at single conductor 14 gauge wires or larger for the installation of my signaling device, but the FAS cable I'm now going to do a little bit different. I'm first going to go all the way down to the heat detector and heat into pull station, and the pull station I'm going to end at this junction box. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to allow for a connection of the smoke detector and the pull station. So I've done a T-tap in the middle of my fire alarm SLC loop. Now keep in mind, T-taps could have been done in different locations through the SLC loop, and this would have had an effect on the overall wire count in each conduit. Finally, example F, an addressable DCLA. So we've got one SLC loop and one NAC loop, Class A conventional. So let's first do our NAC loop, which is exactly the same as the conventional system that we looked at earlier. Now I'm going to do my FAS cable, and what you'll notice is that, well, there's actually no difference in the wiring for a Class A conventional or a addressable DCLA. I still have a 16.2 FAS cable that comes from the fire alarm panel to the first detector, but of course the smoke detector is now an addressable smoke detector, and then out of the smoke detector into my addressable pull station, and out of my addressable pull station, returning back to my fire alarm panel. So, hopefully this gives you a good idea as to the minimum wiring required for addressable and conventional fire alarm systems.